In the mountains of western Iran, something is beginning to break. Not loudly, not in the way most people expect war to begin, but through coordinated flashes of violence, unexplained deaths, and political pressure building faster than any single institution can absorb. And all of it is happening under one invisible constraint, a 60-day clock. Because behind closed doors in Doha, negotiators are attempting something that looks increasingly fragile by the hour. Last attempt to stabilize a collapsing strategic framework between Iran and the United States. On paper, it is called a Memorandum of Understanding. In reality, it is a temporary pause inside a system already under simultaneous pressure from internal rebellion, external strikes, and accelerating distrust. And while diplomats argue over terms in air-conditioned rooms, the ground outside is moving. Fast. In western Iran's mountainous border regions, multiple armed incidents erupt within a narrow 24-hour window, not in a single location, but across a wide arc of difficult terrain stretching through Kurdistan and surrounding provinces. Different valleys, different units, different engagements, but one shared pattern emerges in analysis timing. Because these are not isolated tactical encounters. They resemble a distributed sequence of coordinated pressure points across terrain that has historically been difficult for centralized control to stabilize. The Zagros Mountains are not just geography. They are a structural advantage for irregular forces, steep elevation, fragmented valleys, limited armored mobility, and communication constraints that turn conventional response operations into delayed reactions rather than immediate containment. For state security forces, this is not a battlefield where superiority in numbers guarantees control. It is a battlefield where local knowledge and mobility matter more than formal hierarchy. And in this environment, even small coordinated movements can produce strategic visibility far beyond their scale. But what makes this moment different is not just the geography. It is the synchronization. Because at the same time these clashes unfold in the west, another event occurs hundreds of kilometers away. A senior figure within Iran's naval military messaging structure is reported dead following a highway incident in southeastern Iran. Official channels describe it as an accident, but in strategic analysis, the importance is not the classification, it is the timing. Because this individual was not a peripheral figure. He was part of the public-facing command structure responsible for signaling, messaging, and deterrence narratives connected to maritime security in the region. In other words, a communication node within a broader strategic system, and his death, whether accidental or not, lands at the exact moment internal clashes are spreading across multiple provinces, which creates a layered problem for Tehran. Not a single crisis, but overlapping instability. One kinetic, one informational, one political, and all occurring while negotiators are still attempting to preserve a framework agreement in Doha that depends entirely on perception of control. Because the agreement itself is fragile, it requires Iran to reduce enrichment activity, restructure sensitive stockpiles, and accept new arrangements governing maritime passage through the Strait of Hormuz. That exchange, sanctions relief and partial economic reintegration. But agreements like this do not exist in isolation. They depend on domestic stability to hold, and that stability is now under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. In strategic terms, this is what analysts describe as multi-domain strain, internal security pressure, external military signaling, economic constraint, and diplomatic deadlines all converging within the same operational window. And that window is shrinking, because every actor involved is operating under different incentives. The Kurdish coalition in western Iran is not acting as a single monolithic force, but rather as a coordinated alignment of groups with long-standing regional presence, now operating with improved synchronization across difficult terrain. Their evolution is not simply military, it is organizational. Coalitions that were once fragmented are now increasingly aligned in timing and messaging, even if their capabilities remain uneven. At the same time, Iran's internal security apparatus is stretched across multiple priorities: border stabilization in the west, infrastructure protection in strategic maritime corridors, and political continuity during a sensitive leadership transition phase. Each of these alone would be manageable. Together, they create a bandwidth problem, because no centralized security system can respond optimally on all fronts simultaneously without degradation in response speed. And in modern asymmetric environments, response speed is often more important than response strength. Meanwhile, the political layer adds another dimension entirely. Because negotiations in Doha are not occurring in a vacuum, they are happening under the shadow of recent military escalation patterns, contested interpretations of prior strikes, and unresolved questions about enforcement mechanisms along maritime routes that carry global economic significance. which means that every incident on the ground immediately feeds back into the negotiating table, and every diplomatic delay feeds back into operational uncertainty on the ground. This is the feedback loop, and once it stabilizes, it becomes self-minus reinforcing. But what makes this particular loop dangerous is that it is now interacting with internal fragmentation, because when a state faces external negotiation pressure while simultaneously managing internal armed pressure, its ability to calibrate responses becomes increasingly constrained. Not because it lacks power, but because it must prioritize visibility of control over strategic patience. And that changes decision-making logic fast. At this stage, analysts are no longer asking whether these events are connected in a direct operational sense. The more important question is structural. Whether Iran is entering a phase where multiple low-minus to minus-medium intensity pressures begin to converge into systemic instability rather than remaining separate contained events. And that is where the significance of the 60-day clock becomes critical, because it is not just a diplomatic deadline. It is a synchronization point, a moment where multiple pressures either resolve into a stable framework, or continue compounding into escalation across multiple domains. And right now, all indicators suggest that convergence is accelerating faster than resolution. What begins to emerge from all of this is not a single battle, and not even a single crisis, but a system under simultaneous compression. Because when Western Iran experiences coordinated armed activity across mountainous terrain, and when a senior military minus linked figured eyes under unclear circumstances on the same operational day, and when negotiators in Doha are still trying to stabilize a 60-day diplomatic framework, these are not separate storylines anymore. They are stress signals inside one interconnected structure. And the question shifts. It is no longer what happened. It becomes how many pressures can a system absorb before it stops behaving predictably. Inside Iran's internal security architecture, Western border regions have always represented a structural vulnerability. Not because they are ungoverned, but because they are governed differently. The terrain itself favors decentralization. Movement is fragmented. Communication is delayed. And enforcement relies heavily on localized presence rather than centralized control. That creates a natural asymmetry. Small coordinated units operating in familiar terrain can generate disproportionate strategic disruption, especially when multiple incidents occur within compressed time windows. And in this scenario, compression matters more than scale, because for incidents an isolated geography would be treated as background instability. But for incidents within a single operational window across multiple provinces begin to resemble something else entirely, a synchronization pattern. And synchronization is what security institutions fear most, because it suggests coordination beyond local randomness. At the same time, Tehran is not dealing with a single front. The diplomatic track in Doha is still active, but increasingly constrained by its own internal contradictions. The framework depends on compliance mechanisms that are difficult to enforce without mutual trust. And trust is exactly what is eroding, because every incident inside Iranian territory weakens negotiating leverage, and every external strike or perceived violation strengthens internal political arguments for escalation rather than restraint. So the system begins to oscillate between negotiation and retaliation, between containment and demonstration of strength, between diplomatic continuity and internal legitimacy pressure. And oscillation is unstable by nature. It does not converge. It amplifies. This is where the internal political dimension becomes decisive, because leadership systems under pressure rarely respond linearly. They respond reputationally, meaning that actions are judged not only by their strategic outcome, but by how they appear domestically. This creates a structural constraint. Even limited restraint can be interpreted as weakness. In high-minus pressure environments, perceived weakness is often more dangerous than material loss, which brings us back to the sequence unfolding in parallel: border clashes in mountainous regions, high-minus profile unexplained deaths within military-minus linked structures, and diplomatic negotiations attempting to hold together a framework that depends on D-minus escalation behavior from both sides. None of these are fully resolved independently, but together, they generate a cumulative effect, a sense that multiple layers of stability are being tested at once. Now, importantly, this does not automatically imply systemic collapse, but it does shift the strategic environment into what analysts often describe as high-volatility equilibrium, a condition where the system is still intact, but increasingly sensitive to small inputs. In such environments, minor incidents can produce disproportionate reactions, not because the actors become irrational, but because their margin for error shrinks. And when margin for error shrinks, timing becomes everything. This is why the 60-day negotiation window matters so much, because it is not just a deadline. It is a constraint that forces decisions under incomplete information. and incomplete information is where miscalculation happens. Meanwhile, external observers, regional states, global markets, and military planners are not reacting to isolated events anymore. They are reacting to patterns. Shipping behavior through maritime corridors adjusts. Military posture shifts incrementally across bases and fleets. Economic actors price in uncertainty rather than stability. And once markets begin pricing uncertainty as structural rather than temporary, feedback loops extend beyond the battlefield into global systems. That is where strategic instability stops being regional and becomes systemic. At this point, the core question is not whether escalation continues. It already is. The question is whether escalation remains bounded, or becomes self-minus reinforcing. Because bounded escalation can be managed through signaling, negotiation, and calibrated response. Self-minus reinforcing escalation cannot. It begins to generate its own justification, each action producing the next reaction, each response narrowing the available options for restraint. And that is the most dangerous phase of any multi-minus actor conflict environment. Not open war, but controlled instability that is losing control. -FINALCLOSINGSEQU and CEU to be NDINGHOOK. Right now, every side involved is still acting as if it controls the tempo, but the pattern emerging on the ground suggests something more fragile. A system where control is still claimed, but increasingly difficult to enforce evenly across all domains. Western Iran remains active. Diplomatic negotiations remain open. Regional security forces remain deployed. And yet none of these layers are stabilizing the system on their own. They are only holding it in motion. And motion is not the same as stability. So the real question becomes this: at what point does coordination across multiple pressure points stop being manageable and start becoming irreversible? Because once that threshold is crossed, the system no longer waits for political decisions. It reacts faster than leadership can respond. And by the time signals are fully understood, the next phase has already begun.